Well, good day, everybody. Welcome to Faith Seeking Understanding. I am Alan Bevere, your host. I am a pastor, retired, a professor. I am a Bible moth, a theologian in exile, and a peddler of hope. And I am the self-appointed Anselm of Canterbury Chair of Podcast Theology and Culture here at Faith Seeking Understanding University, a completely fabricated institution of higher learning. But where all seekers are invited to ponder profound things. And we've got a great conversation today with you. I am pleased to welcome David Koyzis, who is a theologian, political scientist, and uh, and we'll keep talking here, David, in a little bit. How you doing this today?
Oh, I'm doing fine. I don't think I would call myself a theologian. I think that's a little bit of an overstatement.
Okay, well, I
But
think you do a lot of good theology in here, so okay.
oh
All
well,
right.
thank you. I
I'll
appreciate that.
I'll let you I'll let you label yourself. Uh,
Okay,
but you're certainly a political scientist, to be sure.
I am
You
indeed.
write
Yes,
and you
I
write
have the
from a
credentials for that.
and you write from a Christian perspective. So this
Definitely,
is
most
important. And
definitely.
so today we're going to talk about your latest book called Citizenship Without Illusions, a Christian Guide to Political Engagement. This is a wonderful book, very thought-provoking, and I appreciate you taking the time to be here today. Um, I want to begin the conversation because I think one of the things about you, you are retired, you live in Canada. You have dual citizenship, as you were telling me, American and Canadian,
That's right.
uh, which provides again, and you talk about that in your book, dual citizenship. So we'll talk a little bit about that too. But you wrote a book about 20 years ago, and I want to start with this. And this is the old edition. It's in a second edition, so I got to get that. But Political Visions and Illusions. And I found this fascinating years ago, but I wanted to start with it to get into the conversation of the current book because I think it's swirling around in the context of your book. And you write um, about that first book. You write that in your second book. You say in that book, the first book, my thesis is that the ideologies are contemporary manifestations of a very ancient phenomenon, namely idolatry, and that each tells a story of salvation imitating the biblical redemptive narrative. And you talk about a lot of ideologies. You talk about liberalism, conservatism, nationalism, and others. What makes contemporary ideologies idolatrous?
Yes, and an idol is something that we take out of God's creation and we elevate it to the position of God Himself. In other words, we've taken something that's good, a genuine good that God has created, and we make a false God out of it. In ancient times, we read in the Bible, in particular, of the people who surrounded the Israelites, and even the Israelites themselves, as we well know from the Old Testament history books and from the prophets. They worshipped gods that they represented by statues or various tangible structures that were supposed to represent that particular god. The Philistines had Dagon, the Canaanites had Baal, or maybe the Baals. I think there was perhaps more than one. And the Israelites, unfortunately, had a tendency to follow in the wake of their neighbors in worshiping uh, worshiping these false gods. Now, we in the 21st century, we don't generally uh, carve statues and literally bow down and worship them. Our gods are more intangible. So we worship things like success, uh, uh, maybe wealth. You know, we worship things um, that are good in themselves, but we make too much of them. So if we're talking about political ideologies, generally they have fastened on something that's a genuine good. You know, for conservatives, it's tradition. For liberals, it's individual liberties, freedoms. Maybe human rights is another way of putting it. If we're talking about socialism, it's community of a certain sort. Same with nationalism as well. That the nation is made too much of, and so it attains a kind of godlike character in the hearts of the people who are following this.
Okay, so the problem per se isn't being conservative or liberal. It's elevating that to an idolatrous character. Uh,
Yes, and so yeah, and if you worship that one thing, it tends to exclude all of the others.
right.
And so if you're a consistent liberal, you are going to likely deprecate community in some fashion, even though we need community to survive and
Mhm.
to thrive. And the other way around as well. If you're a nationalist, you may deprecate communities other than the nation. You may deprecate. You may end up uh, um, neglecting the rights of individuals for the sake of that particular community.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. And before we end today, I do want to get your assessment on the current situation in the United States.
Of
Get
course.
get some of your thoughts on it, obviously.
Yeah,
Uh,
I did imagine that you would neglect
yeah,
that.
we just can't. I mean, how can we pass that over, right?
No.
So that brings us then to this current book, Citizenship Without Illusions, where you say that basically the purpose of this book is how do we, you're raising a question here, how do we live as citizens of God's kingdom while discharging our responsibilities as citizens of our respective political communities? So how do we navigate what it means for us as believers to be citizens of God's kingdom, but also citizens of an earthly nation? And how do we engage in that? So that's your purpose here uh, in the book. What can I ask what your motivation was for writing this book?
Well, it actually started with a conversation with a good friend who lives in North Carolina.
Mhm.
I've known him for a number of years right now, and he has been a great supporter of my work and has had used it when he was no longer teaching, but when he was teaching, he was using my first book. And I had a conversation with him several years ago, and he said, "David, I think you should write a book about citizenship."
Mm,
And I thought, yeah, okay, that would make sense because I think I don't know that citizenship is exactly neglected in Christian circles, but I do think that we don't take it as seriously as we ought to.
yeah,
So it's an old, almost a cliche to say that we are citizens of two kingdoms. We are citizens of God's kingdom. We are citizens of the earthly kingdom. This is an insight that we find already in Saint Augustine, 1500
yeah.
years ago. And and as a matter of fact, it's not we're not just citizens of two kingdoms. I would almost argue that we're citizens of quite a number of overlapping kingdoms, if you will, or overlapping realms, spheres of human concerns. And so what we have to do is to try to live a balanced life in which we recognize that we are simultaneously parents to our children, we are children to our aging parents. Uh, my parents have not been gone all that long. They lived into their 90s. My mother just died about 2.5 years ago. My father died just over 5 years ago. But I took that very seriously, my obligations to my parents as they were aging. Although I lived at something of a distance from them. I have obligations to my wife, to my daughter, to my church community, and so forth. While I was still working, I had obligations to my employer. So this is a matter of recognizing that all of these obligations and responsibilities that we have uh, all fall under our ultimate loyalty to the kingdom of God.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, and that's the point that I'm trying to make in this particular book. That
yeah,
as citizens, this is one of the spheres that, as citizens of a particular state, of a particular political community, we have obligations to our political communities. They do not overwhelm absolutely everything we do in our lives. I will not argue that it's our highest responsibility in the way that some followers of political ideologies would do, but I do argue that our political responsibilities are important, insofar as we are citizens of our respective political communities.
Yeah. One of the things I thought about as I was reading through your book too is the notion of social contract, and that, we are born. For example, I was born an American citizen. You were born an American citizen. I mean, just by virtue of my birth, I came into a social contract that was imposed upon me in some sense, right? I didn't get
Yeah,
to decide not to do that. I'm always amazed
yeah.
at the number of people who seem somehow to think that by virtue of my location that I didn't get to choose, whether it's my family, whether it's my nation, whatever it is,
Yeah,
that I just have responsibilities. I don't get to
yeah,
choose not to do that. Uh,
that's right.
and we see this often, I think, in conversation, and I see it. I see it on both left and right, where we somehow don't think. I mean, one of the things for me is, as I said, when we went through COVID uh, in the United States, that often listening to Christians, it sounded to me like I have my rights supplanted. I need to love my neighbor. And I'm not arguing against the notion of people having rights. I'm just saying that it seemed like first and foremost, it was about what I had the freedom to do or not to do as to what should I do to best express my love for neighbor.
That's right, and that comes out of the larger liberal narrative.
Yeah,
People on both left and right are partaking of that larger liberal narrative, and that's one of the points that I make in Political Visions and Illusions. That it's not as though conservatives and liberals are polar opposites, because they're really not. In North American political rhetoric, probably the United States more than in Canada, they're seen as polar opposites, but they really are not.
yeah,
There are so-called. I'm not really fond of the whole left-right dichotomy, but if you're going to use it, there are left centrist and rightist liberals, but they're basically partaking of that same narrative.
right. Right. So they're actually two sides of the same coin. Fair, is that
I
fair?
think so. Yeah, yeah, and that's something that Patrick Deneen uh, um, pulls to the surface in his book "Why Liberalism Failed," which was written about 6 or 7 years ago.
Okay.
And I do quote that in the second edition of Political Visions and Illusions, which came out in 2019.
Yeah. Okay. I gosh,
But I but can I respond to your statement about social contract that you made a few moments
please,
ago?
please, please do
Because
that.
yeah, because I don't think that's the best way to understand our relationship to the larger political community.
Okay.
And again, social contract flows out of that larger historic liberal narrative. But we tend to think that I my obligation should be activated only insofar as I have chosen to assume that obligation. But I think that's wrong, because we can't really live our lives in accordance with that. Nobody lives their lives in accordance with that. We are born to certain kinds of obligations. That flows out of a posture of gratitude to God and for the very communities and persons who have shaped us into the people that we have become.
Yeah.
So, we are born to citizenship in a particular country. We are born to our parents. We are born into a particular birth family. It is true that we choose our marital partners, but, I am only 2 generations removed from arranged marriage. My grandparents in the island of Cyprus, so these are my father's parents, where their marriage was arranged probably about 110 years ago.
Yeah.
Uh, and that was the way things worked at that time. It's not as though there was not an element of choice that enters into it, but that's not the foundation of the very structure of marriage. It's not the foundation for political community, and it's not the foundation for family life either. So and I would make the same argument about the gathered church community as
Hmm.
well. Even those churches that will not baptize infants, nevertheless retain a dedication, a parental dedication right that they have imported into their liturgies, in which the parents promise to raise the child in the faith. So even that element is something that we are born to. We are born to obligations to our church communities
Hmm.
as well, out of a posture of gratitude for what they have done to make us who we are.
Yeah, good. Excellent. Excellent. Yeah, that's where we like to think that we are completely free for our own self-determination, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But it's really not the case.
It
Uh,
is not. No,
it's surely not the
no,
case.
no,
Yeah.
no. And every choice we make is not made in a vacuum,
Yes.
because it's made in response to something that has happened to us or has shaped us in the course of our lives.
Yeah.
So every choice I make right now, even by talking to you right now, I can trace back to parental upbringing in some fashion over the past 70 years.
Yeah.
Or my marriage to my wife, or the fact that I have a daughter and a son-in-law, all of these things have an impact on shaping me, shaping the person who I am. So I am not self-made.
Right.
I'm not
Right.
self-made.
It
No.
is really a myth, isn't it? I always like to point out in
Yeah.
talking about that back in the 70s, I think you'll remember the Marlboro Man, right? Who
Yeah.
smoked the cigarettes. He was the guy who was free and independent, and
Yeah.
original Marlboro Man ended up dying of lung cancer, right?
Yeah, of
So,
course. Yeah.
so we are not we're not as we like to think that we are. Um, so let's talk a little bit. There's a couple things I want to poke at because I think they help bring some light here. Voting. You talk about voting, and of course, voting. I think is important. I think we should vote. Um, but you have an interesting discussion about voting when our choices are not optimal or we don't perceive our choices to be good. I've never thought my choices were ever good personally in voting. Um, I had to chuckle. I had to chuckle with to some of my friends when Donald Trump in 2016 clearly looked like he was going to be the Republican nominee and they were going to vote for him. And of course, I expressed my reticence and why I didn't want to vote for him. And they would always respond by saying, "Well, there's no perfect candidate." To which I always
Yeah.
said, "That's not even up for discussion. Who's
Yeah.
saying that? I'm not saying that. Nobody's saying I can't vote for Donald Trump because he's not a perfect candidate," which
Yeah.
seemed to me to be a dodge. Um,
Yeah.
but the reality is choices are less than optimal. What advice do you give people who take their Christianity very seriously and who take it into the voting booth, who want to vote as Christians, which I think is a good thing to do? Um, what advice do you give to Christians who say, "Oh my goodness, I can't believe the terrible options we have"?
Right. Yeah. That was a chapter that I struggled over in
Yeah.
the book, because I have struggled over that issue myself, and I'm not even certain that in this chapter, my advice is definitive. Because I don't think that it really can be.
Mm.
There's no settled, one alternative that's better than others. And when you enter the voting booth, I think what I would say is that voting is not the most important thing we can do as citizens. So if we think that our citizenship is largely wrapped up in our entering a voting booth, the polls, and then voting for one candidate over another, I think that's wrong.
Yeah.
I think that's a very small part of genuine citizenship. At the same time, voting is important, but I think we need to be realistic that when we enter the polling booth, we recognize that we are voting for good and we're voting for evil.
Mm.
And generally, what we have to do under our electoral system, which political scientists call it single member plurality, the popular media refer to it as first past the post, or perhaps winner take all. The whole country is divided up into so many electoral districts, and you can vote for only one candidate, and that tends to support a two-party system, as opposed to varieties of proportional representation in which you're more likely to have multiple parties, as in European democracies such as Germany, France, the Netherlands, Belgium, and so forth. Under our system, which is pretty much the same in the United States and Canada, we have to hold our noses and vote for a candidate, not that we think will do the most good, but generally the one that we think will do the least harm.
Yeah.
And that's often what we have to settle for. That said, there should be minimal standards set in place for candidates who aspire to stand for public office. Prior to about 1968, the political parties in the United States had a vetting process in place. And basically, it would consist of local office holders who would examine candidates who wanted to stand for the presidency. They would decide, with the help of party primaries, which had been established earlier in the 20th century, they would make the decision as to who was going to run and who was not really um, eligible
Hmm.
to run. So, famously in 1960, for example, you had somebody like Chicago Mayor Richard J. Daley, who was one of the kingmakers in the Democratic Party, deciding in favor of Jack Kennedy. Also, Lyndon Johnson, 4 years later, who of course had been vice president and had acceded to the presidency after Kennedy's assassination. But that was the system that was in place until 1968. Events of that year, a very turbulent year, you had two political assassinations: Dr. Martin Luther King, uh, Robert F. Kennedy. Uh, you had trouble in Chicago at the Democratic National Convention that year. Hubert Humphrey, who had not entered a single primary election because Johnson had uh, left the campaign in late March 1968. Humphrey became the presidential candidate, but there was a lot of discontent with that because he had not stood in any of the primaries. So what ended up happening is that the system ended up becoming overly democratized so that virtually anybody could stand for election. And all they had to do was enter the primary elections, and the state caucuses, and they would emerge as front runners, and the party had to go along with them.
Yeah.
And so that it stripped the power from the local kingmakers, and it ended up excessively democratizing the system. And I don't think that was a very good thing.
Yeah.
You ended up having a series of atypical candidates, beginning with Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, the former movie star. Most spectacularly, I think things went wrong with Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And that vetting process desperately needs to be put back in place.
Mm. Yeah, there should be an assumption. I grew up hearing anybody can grow up to be president in America. Well, that's not
Yeah,
true. That's not
and
true.
it shouldn't be true.
And it shouldn't be true. And not
And it
everybody
shouldn't
should
be
be
true.
president.
Yeah.
There are people who
No,
should not
exactly.
be in charge, right?
Absolutely.
I mean,
Absolutely. That's
we
right. Yeah.
we do
Yeah.
this, we do this in business, we do this in other organizations. We say,
Yeah.
no, they should not be running the show. And so
Exactly. That's
we
right.
have
Yeah. Yeah.
to, yeah, well, I don't know that we'll ever get
Yeah.
that process back. I mean, maybe unless things get
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
rotten. I don't know. So you have a chapter in your book, and I want to get to that and then final discussion in reference to our current situation. You have a
Right.
chapter on when kingdoms collide.
Yes. Yes.
So
Yeah.
what happens when I, as a follower of Jesus, and my commitment to the kingdom of God is central and most important? What do I do when my that kingdom to which I swear and am committed to totally and without reservation, what happens when it collides with the kingdom of America?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, as Christians, our ultimate loyalty is to God and to His kingdom. I don't think there's any question of that. The major issue is when do we know that these kingdoms are colliding to such a degree that we need to stand against one, will stand against the kingdom of this world,
Mhm.
and for the kingdom of God. And that's something that during times of extremity, ordinary people have had to choose. There are some examples that I give in this book. One of them is one of my best friends. His parent he's was born in the Netherlands, 1942. His parents, while he was still a baby, were hiding a Jewish family in their attic, in the attic of their home.
Hmm.
Now, this was not an unusual thing because actually a lot of Christians in the Netherlands were doing exactly the same thing, you know. But of course, it wasn't the kind of thing that you would trumpet for obvious reasons. You know, so this is an example of, you know, people who I know who were actually doing that during the Second World War. You know, or their families were doing that, and there are some others as well. There's some other examples that I bring up in the book. The Reverend Wang Yi, the pastor of the Early Rain Church in Chengdu, China, who is in prison right now for his testimony to Christ.
Hmm.
You know, even Dr. Martin Luther King himself, uh, who willingly went to jail for you know, not directly perhaps for the cause of Christ, but for the cause of defending the image of God in his creatures, whose skin happened to be darker than than the rulers of the various southern states.
Hmm.
So you know and we have to decide, well, when do we reach this period of extremity? And I think we need to have a community that's capable of discerning that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
The discernment really matters, doesn't it? Yeah. And you know, you talked about the hiding Jews. A lot of people don't know that there actually is an underground railroad for immigrants in this country. And I'm connected to the immigrant community in some of my work, and there are people who are working to do exactly what was done in Second World War in Europe, is to hide people who are, you know, they're afraid that are going to get swept up in what's going on right now, and they have made the decision that their Christian witness calls for that. So just a little tidbit there of information. So we talked about kingdoms colliding. So let's talk about the current moment here in the United States. David, I got to tell you, um, I never thought that we would give Donald Trump a second term.
Oh.
Never thought it. I told a couple of pastor friends of mine after the election. Uh, I said maybe I need a good dose of Calvinist depravity because total depravity because holy cow, how in the world did we? And I'm sure we could analyze and drill down all of the reasons why people voted for him, but I've got obviously very, I think, real concerns about what's going on right now in the country that I've never seen before. What's your assessment? You're an American, you're a Canadian, you live in Canada, and you have worked with this stuff. What's your assessment of what's happening right now?
I This is something that again I struggle with, and I do not believe that Trump should have been allowed to stand again after what he pulled on the 6th of January,
Yeah.
2021. You know, nobody should be able to do something like that. You know, that right there should have disqualified him
Yeah.
from running again. But as I said a few moments ago, uh, the vetting processes that were in place up until about 2 generations ago, they're gone now. And if somebody is popular, you know, what we have is a series of beauty contests. If a person is popular, whether they're eligible or not, you know, when Richard Nixon, I cut my political teeth on Watergate. That was one of the things that really influenced me towards studying political science in my
Yeah.
youth. When it became clear that Nixon had been implicated in the cover up of the Watergate break-in in 1972, uh, officials from his own Republican Party came to tell him that the jig is up, that you've got to go. Unfortunately, the Republican Party is filled with what I can only describe as sycophants
Yeah.
who are willing to follow Donald Trump no matter what. What we would need for the system to work is for people in his own party to tell him, you have gone far beyond um, the bounds of what should be proper for a political office holder. You need to stand down, or otherwise we are going to support the Democrats in removing you from office. But unfortunately, the Democrats themselves have become a party that many Americans cannot stand.
Yeah.
And you know, it was the height of stupidity And I know that's a harsh thing to say for Kamala Harris in the latter stages of her campaign last year to say that we are standing so firmly on the right to an abortion
Yeah.
that even those physicians who have religious objections to performing abortions,
Yep.
well, we are not going to exempt them. So the Democrats have become tone deaf on matters of religious freedom.
Yeah.
So, the both parties in this book, I included there was a sentence in this book which you may remember, and I thought certainly that either the anonymous reviewer would flag it or else an
Mhm.
editor at InterVarsity Press would flag it and say, you can't put this in the book. But what I said is that the Democratic and the Republican parties have become diseased parodies of their former selves.
Yes.
Nobody flagged that. Not
Yeah.
the anonymous reviewer, not the editors. I think on some level, many Americans recognize the truth of that statement.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think there have been certainly some Democrats who have been honest in saying that, but I'm not so sure
Yeah.
they're getting a lot of traction in their own party.
No, they're not.
I in
No.
2020 when with the election or 20 I'm sorry 2024 what 2020 yeah in 2020
Yeah, yeah,
I cast my vote for Joe Biden, and of course people assume immediately I'm a big supporter, and I said no, I'm not a
yeah,
big
yeah.
supporter of Joe Biden. I just think Donald Trump needs to go.
Of
Right.
course, yeah,
And
yeah,
he's
yeah,
just worse. So
yeah.
I mean, you're right to say this and that. And is it part as part of this? Is this part of this too? Our two-party system in which we really
Yes.
not allowing candidates have to moderate and appeal if in
Yeah, well, the two-party system worked up until up until this century, really. I
yeah
mean, up until maybe about 2000, there were always members of Congress whom I respected and looked up to, members of both parties. So one of these was Senator Mark Hatfield of Oregon,
yes
whom I saw speak at a church in Minneapolis 50 years ago. And he was one of my heroes. If I don't know that I have heroes, but if I did, he would have been one of my heroes. Another one was Senator Paul Simon from Illinois, who was a Democrat, devout Christian
yeah
again. And this in this century, just in the last quarter of a century since the beginning of the millennium, there is nobody in the American Congress, who calls him or herself a Christian, for whom I have respect.
yeah
And it seems like the whole atmosphere has been poisoned in a way, and the two-party system is preventing parties from dying.
yeah
If we had something like proportional representation in which people's votes would not be wasted, that if you lived in a district where your party was in the minority, your vote would still count to support somebody from that political party, such as they have in the Netherlands, Belgium, and elsewhere.
mhm,
Um, in the Netherlands, I think this has changed now, but about a year or so ago, the Christian Democratic Appeal, which is an institutional descendant of Abraham Kuyper's anti-revolutionary party, which was
mhm,
started in the late 19th century,
mhm.
that was down to about 5 or 6 seats in the second chamber of the Dutch Parliament. It seemed as though it was no longer fulfilling its function. And because the Netherlands has a fairly pure form of proportional representation, which that particular form I would not advocate for the United States or Canada, but that's a different issue. Um, Proportional representation allows parties to rise to power and to die.
Mhm.
The system that is in place now in most English-speaking countries artificially supports dysfunctional parties to
Yeah,
the detriment of the health of the political system as a whole.
yeah, yeah.
That's what's happening in the United States, to a lesser extent in Canada, but I do have fears for this country as well, because we tend to follow maybe about 15, 20 years down the road what's happening in the United
Oh boy.
States.
Oh boy.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Wow.
Not a happy thought.
What can we do? We talked about voting, and you said this will be the
Yeah.
last question. You talked about voting is not the most significant way to be involved. politically. So, what are some other ways that Christians can be involved with the political order that you find are helpful?
Yeah, well, this is what I ended up spending most of my book talking about. You know, as I was writing the book, some you may be aware that there are authors of fiction that they create a character, and then the character almost attains a life of its own and ends up running away with the plot. You know, that's the when I started writing this book, I did not anticipate that I would end up focusing more on the local level than I ended up doing in this book. So, you know, that I think the local level is where we are most likely to see the results of our efforts to better our communities.
Mhm.
You know, the national level, if we're talking about the president or in Canada, prime minister, you know, the government of the day, you know, our vote is going to be one amongst scores of millions of other voters. But on the local level, you know, that's where we are more likely to see the positive results of our efforts to better our communities. And so that's what I ended up focusing on
Mhm.
in most of Citizenship Without Illusions. It wasn't until the last but one chapter where I got into what might be called, you know, well, global citizenship, you know,
Mhm.
national citizenship, and so forth.
Yeah. Oh, politics is local then,
Yeah,
in a
exactly.
sense.
That's right.
Yeah, good,
That's
good.
right. Yeah, yeah.
Wow. All right. Well, David, thank you for this conversation and just appreciate the work you've done. Friends, we're going to put links in the descriptions to his books. He's also a member of the Global Scholars Canada, sends out a monthly newsletter. We will, and a blog he's got that we will put all those links so you'll be able to access them. This is the book Citizenship Without Illusion. I highly recommend it for your reading. And then also the second edition, this is the first edition, but the second edition of Political Visions and Illusions. Yes, I would,
This is the second edition here.
I
So,
I
yes.
would certainly recommend that you read both of them. Very thought-provoking and very helpful. And I think they're really appropriate in these moments of history. So thank you, David. Thank you again. Appreciate it so
You're
much.
very welcome, and thank you for the conversation.
Yeah, very good. All right, friends. This is Faith Seeking Understanding. I'm Alan Bevere. The patron saint of Faith Seeking Understanding is Anselm of Canterbury, who said, I do not understand in order to believe, but I believe in order to understand. So, friends, keep seeking.